I knew something was wrong before I even killed the engine. You spend 30 years living on the same stretch of dry Texas land. You start noticing little things, the way dust sits, the sound of cattle moving at dusk, even the smell of hot dirt after a long day. And that evening, pulling back onto my property after 8 days away at a livestock auction in Amarillo, the air felt wrong. Too quiet. Too still. Then I looked over toward my water tank, and my stomach just dropped. The gauge was sitting flat on empty. 15,000 gallons, gone. Now maybe if you live in the city that just sounds expensive, but out where I live, water is life. You can lose electricity for a day and survive just fine. Lose water during a drought, though. Cattle start dropping weight, crops burn up, Welsh drain dry, neighbors start hauling tanks across county lines. Folks around here understand that better than religion sometimes. So seeing that tank bone dry after I'd filled it before leaving, it hit me like somebody punched straight through my chest. At first I thought maybe a pipe burst underground. Wouldn't have been the first time. This ranch has been patched together with 30 years of repairs, bad weather, and stubbornness. I grabbed a flashlight, walked the north fence line, checking valves, mud spots, anything that might explain it. Then I saw the trench. Fresh dirt. Still dark from being turned over. I just stood there for a second staring at it while the wind pushed tumbleweeds against the fence. The trench cut clean across the edge of my property, headed straight toward the new subdivision built beside my ranch 2 years ago. Cedar Ridge Estates. Bunch of pastel houses dropped into cattle country like somebody pasted a California postcard onto West Texas dirt. Tiny decorative trees, fancy mailboxes, HOA signs every 10 feet. The kind of place where people complain if your truck looks too dusty. I followed that trench another 100 yards, and there it was, bright white PVC pipe connected straight into my water line. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, more because my brain refused to believe anybody could be that bold. They hadn't siphoned a little water with a hose or stolen it in buckets during the night. No, somebody had brought out equipment, dug a trench across ranch land they didn't own, installed an entire pipeline, and tied it directly into their neighborhood sprinkler system like it was some public utility project. And then I found the letter, folded neatly inside my mailbox like they were doing me a favor. Due to ongoing drought conditions, Cedar Ridge Estates has temporarily connected to your surplus water supply in order to maintain community landscaping standards and property values. We appreciate your cooperation and commitment to the greater good. I must have read that stupid thing 6 times. Surplus water supply. That phrase just sat in my head boiling like hot oil. See, people like that, they look at land and only see empty space. They don't see work. They don't see sacrifice. They don't see the years I spent sleeping in my truck while drilling that well because I couldn't afford motel rooms back then. They don't see me fixing pumps at midnight in freezing weather or hauling feed through storms. To them, if somebody has more than they do, then clearly it must belong to everybody. I leaned against the mailbox a while, just staring out toward those glowing suburban houses. Their lawns were green as golf courses, while every ranch around us was turning brown from drought. Sprinklers were ticking back and forth in the sunset, using my water. That's when I noticed old Walter Grady pulling up beside my fence in his beat-up Ford. Walter owned the neighboring ranch east of mine, been there since before I bought this place. He rolled down his window slow, chewing tobacco like always. "You finally saw it, huh?" he said. I turned toward him. "You knew?" Walter nodded once. "Saw contractors digging 3 days ago. Asked one of them what they were doing. Kid told me HOA approved an emergency irrigation expansion." He spat into the dirt. "Figured maybe you signed off on it." I shook my head and handed him the letter. Walter read about 2 lines before snorting. Boy, these people really thought ranchers were stupid. I should have been furious right then, but honestly, what I felt first was disappointment. Years earlier, before Cedar Ridge got fully built, their HOA president had come to me asking permission to connect a tiny emergency fire suppression line to my well. Wildfires move fast out here, and I understood wanting protection. We shook hands on it. One narrow pipe, emergency use only. I trusted them. That was my mistake. And standing there in the fading light, listening to their sprinklers hiss across perfect green lawns while my cattle trough sat half dry, I realized something that made my blood run cold. They hadn't stolen from me because they were desperate. They'd stolen because somewhere along the way, they convinced themselves they deserved it more than I did. That night, I barely slept. Every time the wind shifted, I could hear those sprinklers clicking in the distance like a clock counting down my patience. Around 2 in the morning I got up, poured coffee that tasted like burnt dirt, and sat on my porch staring across the property line at Cedar Ridge Estates glowing under those little decorative street lamps they'd installed everywhere. Funny thing is, when they first started building that subdivision, I actually defended those people. Most folks around here hated the idea immediately. Said city people would ruin the county, drive up taxes, complain about cattle smell and tractor noise. I remember sitting at the diner one morning telling everybody maybe it wouldn't be so bad. People just want a peaceful place to live, I'd said. No harm in that. Walter never let me forget it after this whole thing happened. Next morning, I called my friend Danny Mercer over at the county water office. Danny and I graduated high school together, back before his hair turned gray and my knees started sounding like gravel every time I stood up. He came out around 9, climbed up the tank ladder with me, checked the system, then looked over the pipeline heading towards Cedar Ridge. Well, he said finally, good news is, legally speaking, they're idiots. Turns out my well was fully private, grandfathered decades ago before newer county restrictions ever kicked in. Everything from the pump to the storage tank sat entirely on my land. The HOA didn't just cross a line morally. They crossed it legally, physically, and spectacularly. Danny crouched beside the trench, shaking his head. You know what the craziest part is? He said. This setup probably cost them 15 grand. That much just to steal water? No, he said. That much because they assumed you'd never fight back. That line stuck with me. See, people think anger makes you dangerous. It doesn't. Cold patience makes you dangerous. Anger burns fast. Patience waits. So instead of storming into their HOA office screaming like some lunatic, I drove into town, bought the heaviest industrial padlock Tractor Supply had in stock, picked up 3 and 0 trespassing signs, and came home smiling. By noon, the main valve feeding that emergency line was shut off tight. By 1 o'clock, it was locked. By 2, I was sitting on my porch drinking iced tea when the first phone call came in. A woman's voice, sharp as broken glass. This is Denise from Cedar Ridge Estates, HOA. We've noticed an interruption in our shared water access. Shared. That word nearly made me choke laughing. I said, Ma'am, there's nothing shared about my well. Silence. Then came the attitude. You are creating serious property risks for our residents. I looked out across my cattle pasture while one of my bulls scratched himself against a cedar post. Funny, I said. Digging into somebody's property without permission sounds risky too. She hung up on me. Calls kept coming all afternoon. Some angry, some weirdly entitled, some honestly pathetic. One guy complained his wife's rose garden would die. Another woman said her children were traumatized because the neighborhood fountain stopped running. The fountain. Meanwhile, I had trough levels dropping because these clowns turned my ranch into their personal country club. Around sunset, I got the call I'd been expecting. Vivian Mercer, president of Cedar Ridge Estates, HOA. Now let me paint this woman for you properly. Mid-50s, always dressed like she was headed to a real estate photo shoot. Drove a white Range Rover that had never seen mud in its life. Every conversation with her somehow felt like she was politely explaining why everybody else in the room was beneath her. She'd been after me ever since the subdivision opened. First it was complaints about my cattle getting too close to their fence line. Then my tractor noise early in the mornings. Then she tried convincing county officials my windmill negatively affected neighborhood aesthetics. I swear to God she actually used the word aesthetics talking about a cattle ranch. So when her number popped up on my phone, I already knew this wouldn't be friendly. You need to restore water access immediately, she said before I could even say hello. No. Long silence. Then came that slow, icy tone people use when they think money makes them powerful. Mr. Callahan, perhaps you don't understand the agreement your previous cooperation established. I leaned back in my chair. No, Vivian. I understand it perfectly. Emergency fire access. Not lawn sprinklers. You had excess capacity. It's a drought. Your tank was full. My property was full. Another pause. Then she hit me with the line that changed everything. Well, communities evolve. Sometimes individual landowners need to make sacrifices for the greater good. I remember staring out at my pasture hearing that sentence echo in my head. Because what she really meant was simple. Your property matters less than ours. That's the thing about folks drunk on authority. Eventually, they stop asking permission because they convince themselves they are permission. I told her, You've got exactly 24 hours to remove every inch of pipe crossing my land before I involve the sheriff. And buddy, she laughed. Actually laughed. You'd create a public scandal over landscaping irrigation? No, I said quietly. I'd create one over theft. She hung up. Next morning, I filed reports with the county sheriff's office for trespassing, property damage, and unlawful utility connection. I included photographs, survey maps, drone footage Walter's grandson helped me shoot, everything. Deputy Ruiz came out personally, took one look at the trench, and whistled. Man, he muttered. They really thought nobody would stop him. Then things got interesting. See, small towns survive on gossip the way cities survive on traffic. By lunchtime, half the county knew some fancy subdivision got caught stealing ranch water during a drought. By dinner, people were adding their own details. According to the feed store, Cedar Ridge residents were apparently filling swimming pools with my water. By the hardware store version, they'd built an illegal underground reservoir like Bond villains. None of that was true, but honestly, public sympathy wasn't exactly landing on their side. And then Channel 8 News called me. Walter's grandson had sent drone footage to a reporter friend in Abilene. By that evening, a camera crew was parked outside my gate filming the trench while sprinklers sputtered uselessly behind Cedar Ridge homes. The reporter asked if I felt bad shutting off water during extreme heat. I looked straight into that camera and said, "Ma'am, my cattle don't drink landscaping." That clip spread faster than wildfire. Suddenly, Cedar Ridge wasn't some luxury neighborhood anymore. They were the rich outsiders stealing resources from local ranchers during a drought. Folks around here took that personal. 3 days after I shut the valve off, I drove past the subdivision and nearly laughed myself off the road. Lawns were turning yellow already. Flower beds drooped. Residents stood outside arguing in clusters while HOA maintenance crews scrambled around uselessly dragging hoses everywhere. And right in the middle of it all stood Vivian Mercer, screaming at some poor landscaping contractor while sweat rolled down her face. For the first time since this whole mess started, she looked scared. By the fourth day, Cedar Ridge looked like a neighborhood slowly losing a war. The drought heat was relentless that summer, 106 during the afternoons, no clouds, no rain, just wind pushing hot dust across everything. Out on my ranch, we were surviving because we knew how to survive. We rotated water usage, cut irrigation where we could, hauled reserve tanks when needed. Folks raised out here learn early that nature doesn't care about comfort. But Cedar Ridge, they were built on the assumption that comfort was guaranteed. I drove into town that Friday morning for feed, and nearly everybody at Miller's Supply wanted to talk about the water situation. Some people shook my hand like I'd won a football game. Others thought I should have just let it go to keep the peace. Old Earl Jenkins laughed so hard coffee came out his nose when he heard the HOA fountain had stopped running. Then Walter leaned over beside me and muttered, "Careful now. Once people get embarrassed publicly, they stop acting rational." Turns out he was right. That afternoon, I came home and found tire tracks near my north fence line. Fresh ones. Somebody had cut the chain on my outer gate. Now here's the thing. I grew up around enough stubborn men to know exactly what desperation looks like before it turns stupid. So instead of marching out there with a shotgun like some movie scene, I called Deputy Ruiz and waited. Good thing I did. About 40 minutes later, a landscaping truck from Cedar Ridge rolled onto my property carrying a portable pump and 2 workers who looked absolutely miserable. Behind them came Vivian Mercer in her white Range Rover, sunglasses on, clipboard in hand, like she was arriving for a board meeting instead of trespassing on private ranch land. Ruiz stepped out beside me just as Vivian climbed from her SUV. She froze. For half a second, nobody spoke. Wind rattled the dry grass around us while one of my horses snorted near the fence. Then Vivian adjusted those giant sunglasses and forced out this tight little smile. "Sheriff's Department seems unnecessary," she said. Ruiz tipped his hat. "County deputy, ma'am. And cutting locks on private property tends to make us necessary." You could actually see the calculation happening behind her eyes. She wasn't trying to solve the problem anymore. She was trying to control the damage. Vivian turned toward me. "Mr. Callahan, perhaps we got off on the wrong foot." I almost admired the audacity. 3 days earlier, she was threatening lawsuits. Now suddenly we were neighbors working through a misunderstanding. She stepped closer, lowering her voice like we were old friends. "The board is prepared to offer compensation for temporary water usage." "Temporary," I said. You installed a permanent pipeline. It was an emergency measure. For tulips. Her jaw tightened. One of the landscaping workers awkwardly stared at the ground while the other slowly backed away from the truck like he wanted no part of this conversation. Then Vivian finally dropped the act. You don't understand the pressure I'm under, she snapped. Do you know what happens to property values when landscaping dies? Do you know how many homeowners are threatening legal action against the HOA? And there it was. Not survival. Not safety. Money. Appearances. Control. I looked past her towards Cedar Ridge sitting beyond my pasture. All those identical rooftops lined up under the burning Texas sky. Honestly, for a second I almost felt sorry for her. People like Vivian spend so much time building perfect little worlds that they panic the moment reality refuses to cooperate. But then I remembered my half-empty troughs. I remembered that stupid letter. And I remembered hearing sprinklers running while local ranchers prayed for rain. So I said, sounds like your problem, Vivian. Deputy Ruiz actually coughed, trying not to laugh. That's when she realized she'd lost. You could see it happen in real time, her shoulders dropping slightly, all that polished confidence cracking around the edges. She looked tired suddenly. Older. All right, she said quietly. What do you want? Now most people expected me to demand an apology or force them to tear out the pipeline immediately. Truth is, I'd spent the last few days thinking hard about that. See, droughts were getting worse every year. Development wasn't slowing down either. Cedar Ridge wouldn't be the last subdivision pushing into ranch country, and people like Vivian would always keep trying to take first and justify later. Unless taking became expensive. So I handed her a folder. Inside was a contract Danny helped me draft. $5,000 a month for limited water access. Strict usage caps. Mandatory meter inspections. Automatic shutoff penalties for overuse. They would also pay for every repair to my system moving forward, plus damages for the unauthorized line installation. Vivian flipped through pages silently while the hot wind whipped dust around our boots. Finally, she looked up at me. This is extortion. No, I said. This is business. Extortion was when you dug into my land and stole from me. She hated that answer because she knew I was right. A week later, the contract was signed unanimously by the HOA board. They had no choice. And the funniest part? Most Cedar Ridge residents actually supported it once they learned the truth. Turns out a lot of homeowners had no idea the board illegally tapped into my water line. Several even apologized personally. One older couple brought over homemade peach cobbler and a handwritten note saying they were embarrassed by the whole situation. Vivian never apologized, though. Not really. Last I heard, she lost re-election as HOA president 6 months later after residents discovered how much legal trouble she nearly dragged them into. Apparently, people get real interested in accountability once lawyers start billing by the hour. As for me, life mostly went back to normal. Every month, a check from Cedar Ridge arrives in my mailbox, right on schedule. I used the first year's payments to upgrade my pump system and build larger emergency reserves for the ranch. Walter still jokes that suburban landscaping financed the best improvements I ever made. And sometimes, usually around sunset, I'll drive past Cedar Ridge on my way back from town. Sprinklers ticking softly across those perfect green lawns, paid for fair and square now. Funny enough, I don't even hate those people anymore. But I do think about how easy it was for them to cross that line in the first place. How quickly convenience turned into entitlement. How a whole neighborhood convinced themselves somebody else's hard work belonged to them because maintaining appearances felt important enough. Maybe that's the real story here. Not water. Not lawsuits. Not revenge. Just people showing you exactly who they are the moment they believe the rules shouldn't apply to them anymore. And honestly, I still can't decide which part bothers me most. So tell me what you think down in the comments. Was I justified for cutting them off and forcing that contract? Or should I have handled it differently? And if somebody tapped into your property without permission during a drought, what would you have done? If you enjoyed this story, hit like, subscribe, and stick around because out here in ranch country, trust me, strange things happen more often than folks realize.